So on today's episode, we have Nigel Hamilton, the author of the new book, War and Peace, FDR's Final Odyssey, D-Day to Yalta, 1943 to 1945. And this book finishes your trilogy on President Roosevelt, and I'm saddened to hear that this will actually be your final book. Is that right?
Not necessarily my final book, but probably my last big biography.
Okay. Well,
certainly the last of my FDRs, because he dies at the end.
That is true, yes.
I can't keep him alive. In fact, I had a strange episode where just before I finished writing it, I got writer's block. And at my writer's group, my colleagues said, well, what's the matter? And I said, well, I can't seem to put pen to paper anymore. And they said, well, what comes next in the story? And I said, well, he dies. And they said, well, isn't it obvious? You have a problem with that?
Right. You can't help that.
Right.
So that's good. Even the best writers out there get writer's block. That encourages all the rest of us. Now, I remember the first time I ever heard about you, I was 10 years old, and it was the 30th anniversary of the Kennedy assassination, and you had a book come out on President Kennedy JFK Reckless Youth, and I remember there was also a mini-series about it starring Patrick Dempsey. And so that's the first time I heard about you. It's pretty cool to be sitting here interviewing you. What was that like to have a book of yours become a feature film?
Yeah, it was a television miniseries. Well, it was the only time in my life when I earned a sort of fairly considerable amount of money, at least to get it in $1, because you have to take the money on the first day of cinematography, because otherwise they don't pay up. Yeah, it was a total surprise. And, the book had been turned down by the first publisher in Boston, who was afraid of how the Kennedy family would receive it. Not because it was, not because it was negative about JFK. On the contrary, it was, he was rather the hero of the story. It was just that it was less than positive about JFK's father, Joseph P. Kennedy, the ambassador to London at the time of Hitler, and his mother as well, who probably had too many children and too many cares, and to a great extent, as a biographer, and having interviewed hundreds of his friends right the way through from school through the Navy in World War II and into his career, it became more and more obvious that, many of his problems with women, and he did have a lot of problems with women, went back to his rather cold relationship with his mother. And, as a biographer, I felt I must tell that story. It's a fascinating human story. But, of course, if you're a member of the Kennedy family, and I think Irish Americans are particularly keen to, respect and support and admire their parents. And so they took exception to it. And in fact, they published an op-ed in the New York Times, and the book was called JFK Reckless Youth. They entitled the op-ed Reckless Biography.
Oh, wow. What a response.
It was very surprising. I was just a quiet little English historian and writer who felt that it was time to take a fresh look at this character who'd become almost mythical through the whole sort of Camelot.
Sure. Right.
And so, yeah, it wasn't an entirely... I loved writing the book. I can't say that I liked what happened afterwards in terms of the family response. And not just the family. I mean, the JFK Presidential Library is a federal institution, and my mail was broken open, and
wow.
it really became quite nasty, and that was really what put me off continuing with a sequel I was meant to write.
Right, yeah. Well, that must be a fascinating story on its own. Now, shifting to the subject of this book about President Roosevelt, there's also a personal connection there, and I know that your father had participated in the invasion of Normandy, and it seemed like he knew a lot of the major players during that time. I believe he knew Prime Minister Churchill and his wife, and Field Marshal Montgomery. So if you could kind of talk about that personal connection and how you wrote this book with that in mind.
Well, it wasn't just my father. My father, as you say, had been an officer, a combat officer in World War II, and he was evacuated from Dunkirk in 1940, and then took part in the D-Day landings and served all the way through the Battle of Normandy and into Holland, and ended the war at age 26 as a temporary brigadier in Germany. So he had an extraordinary war, although he came from a very humble background, working class background. But he was decorated in the field by Field Marshal Montgomery, who was the commander-in-chief of the American, Canadian, and British armies at D-Day. So they maintained a close relationship when my father went back into journalism. He'd just been a junior reporter on a local newspaper. And it was through my father that I came to know Field Marshal Montgomery very well. I was a school kid when I first met him, and began inviting me to this converted water mill he lived in retirement. He had been deputy Supreme Commander of NATO. And so Monty took a kind of liking to this young, somewhat ignorant kid. And in fact, Monty took me to stay at Chartwell with Winston Churchill and Lady Churchill for a weekend, and with two of their daughters present.
My goodness.
So I was 19 years old. I was a Cambridge University undergraduate. I was, strange to say, I thought I behaved very well there. And this was about 1964, because it was an extraordinary weekend.
Oh, I can imagine.
It's still very vivid in my memory. But I recently came across a letter that Monty, as he was called, the Field Marshal, wrote to my father, saying that I'd been very badly behaved. I was a sort of typical student, very opinionated, and wouldn't listen to others.
Oh my gosh.
So, but I did talk a great deal with Montgomery about Churchill, Churchill had been Monty's boss from the Battle of Alamein in 1942 all the way through to the end. And Monty had huge admiration for Churchill as a statesman, as a figurehead, as an orator, as a writer. But he had really very serious criticisms of Churchill as a military strategist, and felt that in that sense Churchill was really very much locked into his sort of Victorian upbringing. And didn't really understand modern warfare, and certainly didn't understand how to defeat the Wehrmacht, the German armed forces in World War II. So that is what gave me a kind of curiosity about when I started this project. I never thought it was for a life of FDR as Commander-in-Chief in World War II, as United States Commander-in-Chief in World War II. That was the sort of background of my curiosity about how did FDR get on with Churchill, whom he gets to know even before Pearl Harbor. How did the relationship develop through the war? So It's certainly been fascinating to me as an author and a biographer. And I think it's fair to say that most of my story is pretty revelatory, not because I'm particularly special as a writer or historian, but I think because Churchill himself was so brilliant and such an extraordinary kind of cover-up, if you like. These 6 volumes of fantastically well-written memoir about how he won World War II, basically, and was always right.
Sure.
And but it was so well written that he was actually given the Nobel Prize for Literature largely on the strength of those 6 volumes. Well, no historian, whether American or British, has ever really been able to make much of a dent in that, autobiography. So it was perhaps a little ambitious of me to think that I could, but because I had spent 10 years as a military historian writing the official authorized biography of Montgomery as military commander, I didn't feel inhibited. I just thought, well, it's sort of over 70 years since the war. It's really time to investigate this honestly and let the cards fall as they will. And the 3 volumes collectively, it's called FDR at War. They are to some extent an answer to Churchill's famous 6-volume series, which he called the Second World War.
Oh yes. Well, so one of the biggest parts of your story is the invasion of Normandy. And there's a quote that really stuck out to me. You said that more than any individual alive, President Roosevelt had in truth been responsible for ensuring that Overlord would be mounted successfully in the spring of 1944, an achievement, sadly, that would not be recognized in the president's lifetime, or indeed afterwards, as others claimed the glory. What did Roosevelt do to bring about D-Day, and why has it been kind of overlooked?
For 2 reasons, really, possibly 3. First of all, he didn't live to tell the story, whereas Churchill did. That's the first thing. Secondly, I think he not only didn't live, but the generals, for the most part, lived. Even Patton, for a while after World War II. So each of them either wrote their own life stories or got very competent biographers to do so as kind of standard. And, they didn't necessarily, if you're a serving officer in the United States Navy or Army or Air Force, you answer to your superior. You don't necessarily see that much of the president, and you don't know how involved he is in major decisions of strategy. You are carrying out, if you like, the president's strategy, and then the president dies just a few weeks before the end of the war. So what I wanted to show readers was that FDR had not only believed in a second front, Overlord or D-Day, as it came called, an invasion of northern France, as the quickest way to get to Berlin and defeat Hitler. And this right from 1941, his victory plan of November 1941. He not only believed that, but he was a great strategist in that he realized the more he saw how well the Germans, how professionally they were fighting, and how good they were at battle, and sort of obedient to the Fuhrer, the more he realized that he would have to, and particularly because the British were not fighting very well, certainly in the early part of the war, there were numerous surrenders, not just at Singapore, but, in Tobruk. So he realized that he would have to do this step by step. And I think that is his greatness as a strategist, that he realized that rather than he overruled his military chiefs of staff, General Marshall, the King, he overruled them and said, no, we cannot launch a cross-channel invasion of France in 1942. We get slaughtered. And in fact, the British did launch a sort of mini version of D-Day that summer in August of 1942, and almost 1,000 Canadians were killed, slaughtered on the beaches just in a couple of hours. So the president was absolutely right, and General Marshall, I'm afraid, was absolutely wrong. And he felt that then, from that point onwards, that really the best way would be to put American forces into battle in a place that would allow them, if you like, to make mistakes, which is what happened at the Battle of Kasserine, for instance, in North Africa, when Rommel really ran riot and showed American forces how much they needed to learn. But he was quite determined that once those American forces learned, and we're not just talking about troops, we're talking about the commanders themselves, the integration between air forces and army forces and the Navy. Once they actually learned how to defeat the Wehrmacht in the Mediterranean from North Africa onwards, as far away as possible from Berlin, so that, in other words, they would have long lines of communication, the Germans. Once they'd achieved that success against the Germans, from that point onwards, he was determined to launch D-Day. And in the summer of 1943, he insisted to Churchill that Churchill sign up his British and also Canadian forces to join the United States in mounting D-Day in the spring of 1944. And as early as possible in the summer, because they would need enough months, summer months in northern France to defeat the Germans in open battle. And so his priority from the summer of 1943 onwards was to make sure that D-Day took place. And that becomes, if you like, the drama of this final volume, War and Peace, because Churchill doesn't want to do it.
Right. Now,
I'm sorry. I think that, Churchill gave a number of reasons in his memoirs, but I don't think a true military historian can really take them seriously.
Sure.
It is amazing how, since Churchill died in 1965, how many quite reputable historians and biographers have gone on peddling the Churchill view that, yes, always believed in D-Day and so forth. He didn't. Two times in 1943, he actually came to the United States to argue against D-Day. And then finally, towards the end of the year, he insisted that before the president meet with Stalin, they thrash this out, and he hoped to get the United States basically to back down over D-Day and if possible, for another year.
So you talk about FDR making the fateful decision to choose the commander of Overlord of D-Day, and you say that he used it as a chess piece or as a charade against Churchill. What do you mean by that?
Well, it's complicated because Churchill, just as the United States president is automatically, or by virtue of the Constitution, the commander-in-chief, normally that is not so in Britain. But in World War II, the moment Churchill was appointed prime minister by the king, he made himself Minister of Defense.
Mm-hmm.
And so he became the equivalent of FDR. He was responsible for the forces, not only of the United Kingdom, but because of the British Empire, the forces of the British Commonwealth and Empire as well. That included Australians, New Zealanders, South Africans, but most of all Canadians.
Mm-hmm.
So the president couldn't simply say to his ally, this is how it's going to be.
Mm-hmm.
We're going to carry out these landings in Normandy or wherever across the English Channel. He had to get Churchill to agree to it. And Churchill did agree to it in writing in the summer of 1943, but then went back on his word. And so the book, the new book, begins with the two of them, FDR on his battleship, Churchill on his battleship, converging on their battleships as they go towards North Africa and Cairo to try and thrash this out. And the president has to work out a sort of subtle plan for how on earth he can get this equivalent commander-in-chief of British forces to get in line, to get back in line. The way he does it is basically by using Marshall and General Eisenhower as pawns in a kind of chess game. He keeps pressing for one of them, presumably General Marshall, to be made commander-in-chief of the whole of Europe, all the Allied forces in Western Europe, because in that way he thinks Churchill will be unable to launch these rather madcap assaults and invasions on the Greek islands, for instance, or go try to get through the Dardanelles as he tried to in World War I. So he pretends that he wants Marshall to be made the commander-in-chief of all Europe, and he knows Churchill won't agree to that. Churchill wants to keep British command in the Mediterranean, but he keeps saying he wants it because in that way he can put off the decision until they actually meet at Cairo. Then he can work on him at Cairo, and then together they'll go to Tehran, where they will meet Stalin, and then it will be 2 against 1.
I see. Yeah.
So it's a very clever strategy, and I'm sure he wouldn't want to be thought to have been wily, but dealing with Churchill was an incredibly difficult job.
Oh, sure.
So I have the greatest admiration for how he did it. And this really is the first time I think any historian or writer has been able to put together that whole story of how he managed it. And to me, it is probably, given how vital D-Day was, because Hitler gathered his generals and said, this, if the Allies do choose to cross the English Channel in a second front, that battle will decide the war.
Right.
What the British or Americans are doing in the Mediterranean or in Turkey or whatever is never going to decide the war. Crossing the English Channel will, and therefore, the Allied invasion would have to be defeated. And, in many ways, Churchill had interesting intelligence, because he said to his general, I don't think the British have their heart in it. He must have, through intelligence agents, that Churchill was backing off. And so to me, it's an extraordinary accomplishment of the President of the United States that he not only, in a sense, overrode Churchill, but did so in a way that would get the British nevertheless to participate in D-Day. And I'm very proud that my father, who was British, was able to return to the continent after Dunkirk and part.
Now, more and more information has come out about just how sick President Roosevelt was in that last year of his life. And it's really amazing. And out of everything I've read, you're really the first historian that has clearly described him as terminally ill. And you wrote of his doctor, Ross McIntyre, seldom in the history of medical treatment at that high a level can such willful incompetence be displayed. So what do you mean by that? And what were the effects of FDR's condition?
Well, we're talking about the White House doctor.
Right.
He was a Navy doctor, but he was just, he specialized in ear, nose, and throat. So you couldn't say he was an extremely accomplished doctor for a president of the United States to have, especially in wartime. His great value to the president was that he, this is McIntyre, was that Roosevelt, as commander-in-chief, made him an admiral. And that meant that under U.S. Navy rules, he had to obey the commander-in-chief, who was Roosevelt himself.
Sure.
And therefore, Roosevelt could totally trust and rely on his secrecy if there were any problems, any medical problems. He certainly didn't want other politicians, especially hostile politicians, or even newspaper owners, to know too much about his health. And I mean, the saddest part of the story is that although Admiral McIntyre did do his very best to conceal the president's condition, his concealing of it only made the condition worse. So what happened was, I mean, this final volume is almost like, in terms of themes, going from triumph to tragedy, because the president comes back from Tehran and Cairo, and he is absolutely full of beans. I mean, he appoints, as you said, General Eisenhower rather than General Marshall, once he's won the fight, so to speak. He appoints General Eisenhower to be the supreme commander for Overlord. And but he doesn't just tell him you're going to be commander-in-chief or supreme commander of Overlord. He insists on spending several days with him on the way back from Tehran, and they fly together to Malta. Nearly have a bad accident there, and in the plane, and then they go on to Sicily together. And he, all the time he's telling him to be careful with Churchill and how to go about being a supreme commander. You can see from the photographs, some of which I put in the book, he's as happy as a sandboy. He's full of beans and nothing can stop him.
His normal self.
Yes, and when he gets back, he's feted by everybody in Congress, and there's a huge reception at the White House and so forth, and then he gives a broadcast from Hyde Park at Christmas, and it looks like nothing can stop him. He's gotten where he wants to be. He is truly the supreme commander of all the Allies, or certainly the Western Allies, and he's got not only agreement that the British will help with D-Day, but he's even got Stalin to agree that once Hitler is defeated, the Russians will help the United States to defeat Japan. I mean, these are monumental achievements, really. And at that very moment, he falls ill with what seems to be flu. I mean, we're literally talking about the Christmas of 1943, 5 or 6 months before D-Day. And it's too sad because Admiral McIntyre covered this up and didn't do anything about it, because month after month, the president's health deteriorated until finally, largely because FDR's daughter came from the West Coast and took one look at her dad and went to him and said, get your act together and get a specialist.
Right.
You can hardly breathe. So finally, again,
probably saving his life.
Yes,
to an extent. Yeah.
But it wasn't McIntyre who was very reluctant.
Right.
Anyway, they bring in again a U.S. Navy officer who was an electrocardiologist. So he was at the forefront of diagnosing heart disease.
This is Bruin, right?
Bruin,
Dr.
yes.
Bruin, yes.
Lieutenant Commander Bruin, young, still in his 30s. And when he saw the president at the hospital, the Navy hospital outside Washington where he was working, he basically said, well, he's only got days to live.
Sure.
Well, you can imagine the cat among the pigeons. And, they began to bring in these really high-powered doctors like Frank Leahy, and they all said, oh, you can't, Broome had an idea of using this medication that was rather toxic to try and help him. And
the digitalis, I believe.
Digitalis, yes. Exactly. And these famous doctors said, oh, no, it's far too toxic. You can't do that with the president. He said, listen, he's going to die if we don't get to him.
Right.
Finally, days later, they gave in the senior doctors who weren't in the Navy, actually. And so Dr. Bruin was allowed to give him the digitalis. And basically, that's actually saved his life that week. And then with enough help, he was able to continue both as president and as commander-in-chief in the months, thereafter. But the question then arose in the summer of 44, especially after D-Day. Well, should he stand for a fourth term as president of the United States? And one of the doctors, Frank Leahy, who was a very distinguished doctor from Boston, he said he told the president through McIntyre, you won't survive a fourth term.
Right.
You cannot do this. Or at least you've got to know officially.
Sure. Yeah.
Not going to live that long. So he knows what he's doing, and he doesn't actually, some people have said, oh, well, it was hubris or, arrogance, or innocence or whatever. But he knew exactly what the prognosis was, fatal heart disease, and that he would only basically be able to kind of eke out a presidency. But there wasn't anybody else he could see at that time who he thought would have the stature and the experience to be able to deal with people like Winston Churchill and like Marshal Stalin. And so he decided, I think very reluctantly from all I've seen in people's diaries, to stand for a fourth term. And then, of course, the comedy of how he chooses his vice president.
Right.
It's just unbelievable in retrospect.
Right.
But it all turned out for the best. I think Truman, he, unlike Winston Churchill, Roosevelt he was a lucky man in many ways and had a wonderful talent for choosing terrific subordinates. I mean, if you think that for most of the war, his Secretary of the Army and Secretary, which included the Air Force and the Navy, were both Republicans. He wasn't ideological in that respect. And I think probably it was the right decision to stand. And as we know, he did win the election.
Mm-hmm.
Truman's help. But it was a very sad moment in American history where you have such a commander-in-chief who has done so well to that point, suddenly being felled by a heart condition that medicine at the time simply wasn't able to counter.
So there's a couple of very fascinating figures in your story, and you talk about obviously his wife, Eleanor Roosevelt, and you talk about the other woman in his life, Lucy Mercer Rutherford, and you paint a very vivid picture of her. And it almost seemed that everyone admired her or was infatuated by her, whether it was President Roosevelt or even Daisy Suckley. Can you talk about her background and how she got to know President Roosevelt and how they reconnected?
Yes. I, to be honest, when I began the trilogy, which was only going to be one volume originally, I didn't know a lot about Lucy Mercer, as she was then, and I thought I would be writing very much a military biography, but, focusing on the president as commander-in-chief. I couldn't believe that nobody had ever bothered to write a life of president as commander-in-chief in what must be the most violent war in human history. But anyway, I wasn't expecting to, I could see that there would be some interesting relationships with people like Churchill and the chiefs of staff and so forth, but men, in other words, and knew that he had this sort of lady companion, Daisy Suckley, whom he called distant cousin. She was a neighbor, really, from the Hyde Park area, and stuff. And he liked women's company. I think it was, when you're president, you are, inevitably removed from the hurly-burly. Some presidents, Harry Truman, for instance, loved to play, poker and drink. His way, with his pals, as his way of, detoxing after a very stressful day. But FDR, bless him, enjoyed the company of women, not necessarily terribly smart women, but women who were affectionate and, I suppose, spoiled him a bit, if you like, because Eleanor didn't. And so I didn't expect to be writing much about Lucy Mercer. But when I came to this final volume, I realized that in the very week that Dr. Broome, Lieutenant Commander Broome, diagnoses the president with fatal heart disease, in that very week, Lucy Mercer, who'd had a relationship with Franklin Roosevelt during World War I, but it had to be ended when it became known to Eleanor and his marriage was at stake. She had married a very rich, much older man, Winston Rutherford. And in that very week that Dr. Broome diagnoses the president's heart condition, Lucy's husband, Mr. Rutherford, dies and becomes a widow. And therefore, in a sense, I mean, he's paralyzed from his polio and so forth, but she is free to become at least a companion. And they've kept a sort of ongoing connection. They've corresponded, and she's attended his inaugurations. She's still, her husband Rutherford was a diehard Republican. Lucy is a Democrat, and basically worked. She's very pretty. She was Eleanor's secretary in at the time of the First World War, and she's very charming, and he just adores her, and she is suddenly available to him in his hour of need. And I don't want to over romanticize, if you like, the story, but I do think that it is a miracle that FDR survived for a further year after this sentence of death. And I do ascribe some of that survival to Lucy, because she can now come, not exactly openly, but everybody knows, all his personal staff and the Secret Service, and everybody knows about it. She visits him at the White House. She visits him at Hyde Park. She visits him at Shangri-La, which is now Camp David, this camp in the hills. He comes to see her in New Jersey at this great mansion that she's inherited when her husband dies. She comes to see him when he's in South Carolina recuperating or trying to recuperate after that first deathly diagnosis. And she stays with him at Warm Springs, the little White House in Georgia. I mean, they have a very tender, loving, late life love relationship, which I find, given his courage in being willing to go on, given all the pain and suffering he's going through because of his medical condition and the stress of that job, I find that very touching. And of course, it goes right up literally to the end. She is 3 feet away from him as he's sitting at his table doing some paperwork and preparing for the inauguration of the United Nations in San Francisco, and she's 3 feet away from him when he finally collapses and looks forward and says he has this terrible headache, and she knows that's it. And she just quietly bows out of his life and death, if you like. Very modest, wonderful woman, I think. And to be honest, people have said, well, Eleanor, when she heard that Lucy had been present when the president died, that she was upset. And so I think that's rubbish. I mean, first of all, it's quite obvious Eleanor did know about the relationship, having been resuscitated. It is greatly to Eleanor's credit that she said nothing, that she saw that this woman was helping her husband to live and finish the war. That was the main thing in Eleanor's mind. Eleanor hated war, but she knew that war had to be finished, and however many Jews as possible be saved, as well as others. So I think it's greatly to Eleanor's credit that she didn't object or make any fuss about it. And I think her only, if you like, her only irritation was that her daughter was wasn't present. Her daughter Anna knew about the relationship and knew that Franklin was at Warm Springs with Lucy at the time of his death, and hadn't told her that. So it was just that she hadn't been told. I don't think she really took it against Anna, and I don't think she took it against Lucy. She even sent her some items after FDR's death.
What would you say to those who would criticize Roosevelt for that relationship?
Oh, come on. I would say grow up, really. I think, especially in the world we live in today, I mean, it certainly was unpleasant for Eleanor when they had their original affair at the time of World War One. And yes, it's perfectly true that Eleanor was devastated when she learned about the affair. We're talking about sort of 1915, 1916, 1917. And, so in that sense, yes, we can be moralistic, because certainly that was a time in our society and our culture when it was very much frowned upon. And, above all, Eleanor she had grown up more or less as an orphan, and one can have great compassion for her because she was very isolated and didn't have a great deal of self-confidence. But the two of them, FDR and Eleanor, they grew as a result of that adulterous affair and the way it came to an end. They grew. They didn't grow necessarily together as a romantic couple, but they certainly grew together as deeply committed husband and wife. What they achieved, especially politically, I don't think will ever happen again in American history. And FDR was, the man mainly responsible for that. He was always encouraging Eleanor to speak up, however much it rebounded on him as President of the United States, often. And encourage her not only politically, but in her private life. I had a number of friends, male, but mostly female, and some very tender relationships. Some have said that they're lesbian relationships. I don't know. I just think they were very close, very loving relationships of two people, like her friend Hick. And FDR did his very best to make that possible, and I think in many ways they are an ideal couple.
So we get to the Yalta conference, kind of the last major scene in the book, and at the time, the atomic bomb is months away from being operational. How did President Roosevelt view the bomb, and how did he view it as he was in negotiations with Churchill and Stalin at Yalta?
Well, the story of FDR and the atomic bomb is a little bit complicated because he not only knew about it, he'd financed it.
Sure, right.
So he was the man behind the bomb right from the very beginning. And he put it under the charge of the Secretary of War, Henry Stimson. But, he watched over very carefully as it was developed, and was worried about the implications because he invited to the White House many of the main participants, scientists involved, including Niels Bohr, who was quite open about what an awful weapon this would be. So he very much hoped that it wouldn't be necessary to use it. And that was one of the reasons why at Tehran he was so concerned to get Stalin to agree to enter the war against Japan, because the Russians were neutral towards Japan and couldn't afford a war on two fronts themselves. So they were remaining neutral. But Stalin did agree that the moment Hitler was defeated, the Russians would enter the war against Japan. And in truth, the Russians put over 1 million men in into Manchuria. So, he wasn't being deceitful or anything. He stood by his word on that.
Mm-hmm.
I think FDR hoped against hope that it would be possible to get the Japanese to surrender before having either to launch an amphibious invasion of the Japanese islands, or in the end to use the atomic to save lives.
Mm-hmm.
I think myself, the jury's out as to whether it's totally speculative as to whether he would or wouldn't.
Mm-hmm.
It's sort of counterfactual history, but
Mm-hmm.
I personally think he wouldn't have hesitated to use it if, certainly once he saw the casualties from the invasion of Okinawa.
Mm-hmm.
It was clear that Japanese were not only defending to the last man, the last soldier, but they were actually forcing Japanese civilians to commit suicide in some madcap idea that the Americans were going to rape every Japanese. So I think had he not died, I'm pretty sure ultimately he probably would have used the atom bomb, rather like Harry Truman. But in that sense, he was, by dying in April of 1945, before it was proved that it would actually work, he was spared that terrible decision, which, to his credit, I think Harry Truman nobly took.
Mm-hmm. Right. Now, one of the things you wrote about also is the creation of the United Nations, FDR's plan to prevent another world war. What was he trying to accomplish at Yalta with regards to the United Nations?
Well, they had already had the United Nations was very much FDR's vision, his notion. He'd been Assistant Secretary of the Navy in World War I, and at the end of World War I, he'd been in Versailles at the time of the Versailles Treaty, and he felt that the failure of the United States to join the League of Nations in particular had sort of doomed the prospects for peace after a terrible war like World War I. And he was absolutely determined that that shouldn't be repeated, and that therefore there should be some. He didn't want to use the words League of Nations, because by then they were tainted, those words. So he invented, first of all, the term United Nations for those countries who were fighting the Japanese. But then he decided that it should be, once the end of the war came, there should be an organization that would be called the United Nations, that would have a headquarters where every country would be able to participate and have a representative. And so at Yalta, although he was so desperately sick and could only manage a few hours a day, he was just determined that the Russians agreed to participate in that, the United Nations project. Even if it meant giving them more seats for representatives than the United States would get. But he just jaw is better than war.
Right.
And so I think it's one of his great achievements that he did get the Russians to sign up to it, and the Russians are still part of the United Nations organization. But the other thing was, he felt that the United Nations as such would be a great talking body and would do great things, perhaps in education and world health and so forth. But, in the end, somebody would have to be the guardians of world security, especially if there was going to be atom bombs flying around. And so he felt there should be some kind of world order, and so he felt the United Nations should be willing to operate at a military level through the kind of senior countries of the world.
Mm-hmm.
The United States, Great Britain, or the British Empire, that, and China, and then thought France as well. And that if they had a sort of committee of those nations who would be able to diffuse critical or crisis, real crisis of countries invading each other or whatever, peace, not necessarily in the most local sense, but peace in the larger sense could be maintained. He hoped for 50 years, half a century. And actually, I think we could say, I would argue as a historian, that has survived longer than he thought possible, over 70 years. Now, we now have a president in a political situation in which that is being called into question. The whole notion of those kind of coalitions and cooperative political agreements and between major countries to preserve world peace. And so I don't know whether it will continue. I think we can just look back and be incredibly grateful that he had the vision to see that. And although he's criticized for having given too much away to the Russians, and so, well, especially over Poland, which is, yes, the saddest of all the cases, I think that you have to look at the positive side. And what he did manage to get the Soviets to agree to, who after all had a completely different vision of society and police order, I think that was a tremendous achievement. And he probably more or less killed him because when he comes back from Yalta, he is just the semblance of a human being. Really.
Yeah, my theory, which is debatable, like any theory, is that Roosevelt saw the UN as in one of its many purposes as a way to permanently get America engaged in the world, so they wouldn't turn back to the isolationist policies, because many Americans felt that had allowed the United States was kind of asleep at the wheel and couldn't play a role balancing the aggressive nations, the Japanese and the Germans. And so it seems like the UN was kind of an ends to a mean in that sense, to prevent another war through America's presence and engagement.
Oh, absolutely. Richard, you're absolutely right. And I quote a number of people who like McCloy, who discussed this with the president. And of course, it's a theme that runs right through the book, right from the very first, from the Mantle of Command in 1941, where the president, the draft or selective military service in America, the continuation of the draft, which had been passed by Congress, is only repassed. This is just before Pearl Harbor, by one vote. The power of isolationism in this country was tremendous.
There's a lot of inertia in that, historical inertia. Yeah.
And we perhaps are falling back into that. Yes, very much so.
You touched upon FDR's decisions regarding Poland at Yalta, and obviously, that's a source of controversy, as well as the way he handled Marshal Stalin. What are your views on that, on how historians have viewed that, and whether they've looked at it fairly or unfairly?
Well, I think there are no secrets there. There were secret protocols attached to the Yalta Accords, true. But nowadays there is absolutely no secret about it, and both Winston Churchill and President Roosevelt knew that Stalin had the boots on the ground, and that if Stalin insisted on moving the Polish border westwards, there wasn't much he could do to stop him. I mean, after all, Stalin had done the same with Finland. Took 10% of Finnish territory, and nobody ever talks about that today. But Poland has a special place, as Churchill himself said, because Britain had declared war on Hitler because of the Nazi invasion of Poland. So, again, I just don't think there's any secret about it. I think it was just an impossible task for the United States or Great Britain, even working together to stop Stalin from occupying Poland and pretty much deciding what would happen there. And of course, that's terribly sad to have to say. And there were people who felt at the time that the president was sort of making nice with Stalin. But I don't really see him as that, as doing that. I think he was very well aware, and I quoted a number of documents where he's completely aware of how awful the Soviet system is, and what a prison camp it is in a sense. He feels over time it will gradually improve. In the meantime, there's not a great deal one could do other than to try and kind of jolly it along and at least not get into a fight. Basically, given the Cold War that eventuated, that is actually what happened. That we got into fights in different places like Vietnam. I think in the larger sense, peace was maintained, especially nuclear, atomic peace, and it's sad that Poland became a kind of pawn in that. But I really don't see that there was any real alternative, or certainly not an alternative that anybody else could have enacted or achieved. Yeah.
Now, obviously, so much has been written about President Roosevelt, but yours is an in-depth look into his time as commander-in-chief during the war. After writing your trilogy, what is the main thing you want people to take away about President Roosevelt that they didn't know before?
I think I can say it very simply. We knew he was a great statesman. We knew he was a great domestic president in terms of particularly the Great Depression and the New Deal. I don't think we knew that he was the greatest strategist of World War II, and possibly the greatest strategist, military strategist that the United States, the most effective military strategist the United States has produced in its history.
It's a very strong thesis. Now, before...
It's up to readers to decide whether they agree.
Sure. Now, but before I let you go, I think earlier you mentioned that when you met Field Marshal Montgomery, you also had a chance to meet Winston Churchill as well. Is that right?
Yes. I told you that earlier in our conversation that I was invited with Monty to Chartwell, which was Churchill's home in the Kent countryside, and I spent several days there, the weekend really, there with Churchill.
I have to ask you, what was that like? I mean, especially in light of what you've written about him and his strengths and his failures during in this book. So what was that like? That must have been an incredible experience.
It was. I mean, for one thing, he was tiny. I think his sort of nominal height was 5'6", but by that time in his life, this is like 1964. By that time in his life, he was probably 5'3".
Oh, wow!
Shrunk a lot, but he had the most beautiful skin still. A lot of people speculated what what special medications he was taking. You know, the blood of young lambs and all sorts of
Oh my gosh.
going on. But I don't think that's true. I think he was born with incredible soft skin. I think his life he had to wear silk underwear because his skin is so sensitive. And I that was just one. Here is this man, the Lion of England, who clearly was incredibly brave himself, from the time he was a young officer, a subaltern on the northwest frontier at the end of the 19th century in India and Afghanistan, incredibly brave, and not just physically brave, but morally brave, as in standing up to Hitler. There are these contradictions, and just a man of so many talents. I mean, Monty took me, for instance, out of the house, and he went to Lady Churchill, and he got the. He said, "I've got to get the key. I've got to get the key." And I said, "What key, Field Marshal?" He said, "The key to the painting hut." So went outside, and we went to this building outside and turned the key, and inside were hundreds and hundreds, I thought, absolutely beautiful paintings.
Oh.
Many of them framed, but some unframed, just the stretched canvases. Or, they're very they're rather kind of like late Impressionist paintings. They're all landscapes. I don't think he did any portraits, but they're absolutely beautiful. And so plus the fact that he was brought into dinner, and I was going to sit on his right hand side and Montgomery on his left hand side. I'm this 19-year-old undergraduate sitting beside the most famous Englishman of the 20th century. And to be honest, I was more spellbound to begin with by these beautiful Scandinavian nurses who were holding him under the arms as he walked in. It took me a while to focus on him. But
I think for any 19-year-old, that's understandable.
Yeah. So I don't think, I'm not ashamed to be critical. I'm sure he would be critical of me, and, he loved a good argument. And I think he would have. I think I'm a reasonly good writer. I think I can tell a story, and I think he would have appreciated that.
Sure.
He wouldn't have agreed with my judgment, but he would have agreed that it was right and proper. That just as he could see across the aisle in the House of Commons.
Right. Yeah. Well, thank you so much for coming on our show. We really appreciate it, and this has been a great conversation. I know your book, so it's called War and Peace, FDR's Final Odyssey, D-Day to Yalta, 1943 to 1945. And I checked on Amazon. It's available on May 7th, 2019. So thank you for the opportunity to, beforehand, to read it. I really enjoyed it, and it's so well researched, and we really appreciate your time being on our show.
Hey, I've enjoyed talking with you.
Thank you.
And I want to say for the first time in my life, a publisher has issued a boxed set of my works, or in this case, the trilogy. So,
that's great. Yeah, congratulations.
I'm terribly touched by that.
Yeah, that's wonderful. So I know that your work contributes a great deal to a man that will continue to fascinate Americans and people around the world for as long as history is being written.
Thank you, Richard.
Nigel's book is titled War and Peace, FDR's Final Odyssey, D-Day to Yalta, 1944 to 1945. It's the final volume in his epic 3-part series on Franklin Roosevelt. It's currently available in bookstores, so make sure you check it out. This American President is produced by myself, Richard Lim, and Michael Neal. Thanks to my dad, Bert Chu. The music in this episode is by Blue Dot Sessions. We also want to thank our Patreon supporters. You too can support us by going to patreon.com/thisamericanpresident and giving any amount you choose per episode that we release. If you like what you've been hearing, you can also help us by sharing an episode on Twitter or Facebook. I'm Richard Lim. We're back next time with more This American President.